Theodore here, and tonight we're diving headfirst into what is quickly shaping up to be one of the most talked about event controversies of the year. A situation that is not just disappointing, but raises serious questions about transparency, expectations, and how far promotional hype can go before it crosses the line into outright deception. Because what we're looking at with Barbie Dreamfest is not just a poorly executed fan event, it's a case study in how a highly polished promise can completely collapse under the weight of reality, leaving hundreds of attendees feeling misled, frustrated, and in some cases outright angry. And to understand why this situation has blown up the way it has, we need to break it all down from the beginning. Because on the surface, this event looked like a dream come true for fans, marketed as a vibrant, immersive 3-day celebration packed with creativity, empowerment, and iconic Barbie culture. And let's be honest, when people hear something like the ultimate Barbie fan event, they're expecting something big, something polished, something that feels official. And that expectation was amplified by the fact that many attendees believed this was being run directly by Mattel, the brand behind Barbie itself. But that assumption turned out to be a critical misunderstanding, because the event was actually operated by Mischief Management, a detail that was technically disclosed, but not exactly front and center in the promotional narrative. And that distinction matters, because when consumers think a global brand is behind an event, their expectations immediately rise. They assume a certain level of quality, organization, and authenticity. And that expectation becomes the benchmark against which everything is judged. So when the reality doesn't match up, the backlash is almost inevitable. And that's exactly what happened here, because the promotional material painted a picture that was not just appealing, but borderline spectacular, showcasing attractions like a life-sized Barbie Dreamhouse experience, an 80s-themed roller disco under neon lights, interactive exhibits, fashion shows, glam bars, and appearances from high-profile guests including Serena Williams and Angel Reese. And on paper, that lineup alone was enough to justify the ticket prices in the minds of many buyers, prices which ranged from relatively accessible day passes at around $66 to premium Dream Pass packages climbing all the way up to $430 or more, a price point that puts this event in direct competition with fully fledged festivals and large-scale conventions. And that's where the problem begins, because when you charge that kind of money, you're not just selling entry, you're selling an experience, a memory, something that feels worth every dollar spent. And according to a flood of attendee reports, videos, and first-hand accounts, that's exactly where Barbie Dreamfest fell apart, because what people walked into was not a vibrant, fully realized immersive environment, but something that many described as sparse, unfinished, and shockingly underwhelming, with massive empty spaces inside the venue that made the entire setup feel incomplete from the moment you stepped in. And visually, that emptiness alone set the tone, because when you walk into a large convention hall expecting energy, color, and activity, and instead you're greeted by wide-open gaps and minimal installations, it immediately signals that something is off, and that first impression is hard to recover from no matter what follows. And as attendees began exploring, those concerns only deepened, because the much-hyped Dreamhouse photo op, which was marketed as a larger-than-life recreation of Barbie's iconic home, turned out to be little more than a cardboard cutout setup with artificial grass, a far cry from the immersive environment people were expecting. And the same pattern repeated across multiple attractions. The so-called 80s roller disco lacked both scale and atmosphere, with no visible neon lighting and a cramped skating area that didn't even accommodate adults comfortably. The bike course was reduced to a few cones placed on the floor, offering minimal engagement, especially for older children. And the Beyond the Stars exhibit, which was described in grand terms as a cosmic celebration of Barbie's impact on science and exploration, was reportedly nothing more than a simple stand-in display. And at that point, the disconnect between marketing language and actual delivery becomes impossible to ignore. Because it's not just about things being smaller or simpler than expected, it's about them being fundamentally different from what was promised, and that's where accusations of false advertising begin to gain traction. And then there's the issue of organization, or rather the lack of it, because multiple attendees reported delays in entry, vendors still setting up after opening time, canceled panels without prior notice, and a general sense of chaos that made the entire experience feel unpolished. And when you combine that with reports of rude staff interactions and restrictions on filming, which some attendees claimed were enforced inconsistently, it creates an environment where frustration builds quickly. And perhaps most frustrating of all was the pricing structure within the event itself, because even after paying for entry, attendees found themselves having to pay extra for many of the activities, from photo opportunities to vendor experiences, which further eroded the perceived value of the ticket, especially for those who had already invested in higher-tier packages, expecting premium access and perks. And speaking of those premium packages, one of the most damaging claims to emerge from this situation is that the Dream Pass did not deliver on its promises, with some attendees stating that they received little to no additional benefits compared to general admission, effectively nullifying the justification for the significantly higher price. And when you're talking about a difference of hundreds of dollars, that's not a minor oversight, that's a major breach of expectation. And it's exactly the kind of issue that turns disappointment into outrage, because at that point, people don't just feel let down, they feel taken advantage of. And yet, in the midst of all this criticism, there were a few elements that did align with expectations, most notably the presence of high-profile guests, with both Serena Williams and Angel Reese reportedly making appearances as advertised, which provided at least some level of credibility to the event. But even that wasn't enough to offset the broader issues, because a few successful moments cannot compensate for an overall experience that many described as lacking substance and cohesion. And as the backlash grew, Mischief Management eventually responded, issuing statements and offering partial refunds, specifically promising to reimburse 2/3 of the ticket cost for certain pass holders, a move that acknowledges the dissatisfaction but also raises further questions about accountability, because while refunds can help mitigate financial loss, they don't restore the time, excitement, and anticipation that attendees invested in the experience, and that's something money can't easily replace. And now the conversation has shifted from whether the event was disappointing to whether it crossed the line into being misleading or even deceptive, with some calling it a scam, while others see it as a case of overpromising and under-delivering. And that distinction is important because it speaks to intent. Was this a deliberate attempt to capitalize on brand recognition and fan enthusiasm, or was it a poorly managed event that simply failed to meet its own ambitions? And the answer may lie somewhere in between, but what's clear is that the gap between expectation and reality was significant enough to trigger widespread backlash. And as we look at the bigger picture, this situation highlights a growing trend in the event industry, where marketing often pushes the limits of what can be realistically delivered, relying on polished visuals and optimistic descriptions to drive ticket sales. But when the actual experience doesn't live up to that image, the consequences can be severe, not just for the organizers, but for consumer trust as a whole. Because every time an event like this falls short, it makes people more skeptical of future promotions, more hesitant to invest in experiences that sound too good to be true. And in a market that relies heavily on excitement and anticipation, that loss of trust can be incredibly damaging. So the question now is not just what went wrong with Barbie Dreamfest, but what lessons can be learned from it. Because if there's one thing this situation makes clear, it's that audiences are no longer willing to accept inflated promises without accountability. They expect transparency, they expect value, and most importantly, they expect the experience they were sold, and anything less is no longer seen as a simple disappointment, it's seen as a failure. And that's where we leave it tonight, a story that started with glitter and pink promises but ended in frustration and refunds, and one that will likely serve as a warning for both organizers and attendees moving forward.